So my daughter designed the logo. It's the traditional symbol of medicine, as some of you may know. It pervades the medical world. It's the snake wrapped around the staff. The staff belong to Asklepios, the ancient Greek deified physician. The logo has green leaves coming from this, and this is an innovation because we wanted to signify growth and flourishing. And as Aristotle mentioned, he called it eudaimonia. We chose earthy colours in order to revere nature and to know our wisdom comes from it. Most medical professionals are ignorant of the founding stories, the values and the principles, and it's hard to imagine medicine in anything other than its modern iteration. But my work on Phronesis curiously led me to Asklepions and let me outline how and set the scene for the day. Snakes are often considered sinister, cunning and sly. Historically, they represent dual expression of good and evil. And in ancient Greek times, they depict alchemy, traveling from the underworld to the earthly world to the heavens without barriers. Snakes shed their skin, and this aspect often symbolizes transformation and healing. So we know the health service has changed so much and is unrecognizable from the days when I watched my father practice general practice in the 1970s and 1980s in the Peak District. Dr. Bob Gill speaks about how there's been systematic deconstruction of the NHS, and it actually began in 1983 when Margaret Thatcher was inspired by President Nixon. And I have some of this information from a very, very well-researched documentary which is available on YouTube called The Great NHS Heist, where Bob Gill is the producer, and I was fortunate to meet him a few weeks ago. And the plan has always been to shift the public service ethos to that of a business, and certainly it seems to be coming to fruition and is actually near completion. We've had internal markets that were created, private finance initiatives, and in 2012, the Health and Social Care Act discharged responsibilities for health ministers to provide everyone with healthcare, and every trust was allowed to make 49% profit from private patients. As you know, I teach medical students at the University of Birmingham. I know they will not be working in the NHS I have known. We face an uncertain healthcare future, but as educators, academics, practitioners and leaders, we can assert the vision of healthcare we believe should be provided. You're an amazing group of people, and we're not just passengers. We're the pilots, and we can shape the journey with courage, creativity, activism and pragmatism. You're all here with an open mind and plenty of collective experience. Let's have fun imagining different healthcare futures using Asklepion as a nexus of ideas. That's a bit busy, you probably can't read the detail, but this is an infographic that I showcased at the first Templeton Global Scientific Conference for Human Flourishing last November. How novel. And basically it's my whole PhD summarised in one. So that was a challenge. So why look at wisdom? My starting point was my experience growing up in a town where my dad was one of a handful of GPs, and I saw the love that the community had for him. Then my experience in medical school made me think something is missing. And in retrospect, I think it was the care, love, and wisdom. My early experiences of teaching ethics were very rules-based, based on Beauchamp and Childress. Again, I felt something was missing. My MMed dissertation was on mind lines and tacit knowing, and it made me come to realize how important metacognition is. And then comes my PhD. I wanted to capture qualities I knew existed, but were rarely spoken about because the focus was often on underperformance and fitness to practice. So basically what I did was I chose a wisdom scale that approximated to Phronesis because there was no scale for Phronesis at the time. And I used the Ardelt 3D wisdom scale. So this looked at the cognitive, the reflective, and the affective aspects of wisdom. Phronesis, of many of you know, is practical wisdom. It's about doing the right thing at the right time for the right person and the right reason. And it has a moral orientation. It's an intellectual virtue, as described by Aristotle, with the other intellectual virtues being Sophia, which is theoretical knowledge, nous, which is insight, episteme, technical knowledge, and techne, which is technical craft and skill. Phronesis is a master virtue, a conductor, which oversees all the other virtues. Aristotle felt that intellectual virtues could be taught and learnt, unlike moral virtues, which need to be habituated. Suggesting that practical wisdom could be of value in teaching. And not only that, Phronesis has been described as being essential to the work of a doctor. And this was first described by Pellegrino and Tomasma. And it's obvious as to why, because medicine is a moral practice. So if I briefly go through that infographic, I guess my question was, what are the constituents of a wise doctor? So I then went on to administer the 3D wisdom scale to 211 GPs in the West Midlands across 5 different events. And one of those events included a GP training scheme, so relatively young people in training. I then went on to take biographic interviews of the highest scoring 10%. And there was 20 in total, and I managed to get 16 interviews from them. I was also encouraged to interview the low scorers. But interestingly, the low scorers on the initial questionnaire, many of them didn't put their details to progress to the next stage, which actually fits in with openness to experience. But anyway, I managed to get hold of 2 of the low scorers. It's not really a hugely statistically valid comparison, but there was some comparisons that could be made. And then when it came to doing the interview, I asked them a single question and I didn't interrupt. So this is the Wengraf biographic narrative interpretive method. And the question I asked them is, I'm interested in your experiences in the things, events, and influences that have made you the doctor you are today. Some people were able to speak for 2 hours, almost without pausing, and others for half an hour. And admittedly, the ones that spoke for half an hour were in fact the GP trainees. And I just needed to express to you that of the 20 high scorers, 2 were GP trainees. They were under 30, and they had very high levels of wisdom, which is encouraging. And I think that should be encouraging to younger people as well, that it isn't just age that makes you wise. And in fact, the irony is they were probably wiser than their trainees. Mm-hmm. So as we go on, I took the interviews, and then it came to analysing them. And the analysis process was quite interesting because it involved using a panel. And Mike, very generously, was one of those panel members, where we broke down the transcripts and looked at the lived life and the told story of those wisdom exemplars. We were then able to come up with vignette statements, which were like a paragraph, which we're then able to use in teaching practice. But I also analysed it a different way, and I used corpus linguistic frequency analysis and came up with very common words and themes. And those themes I'll talk about in a minute. There were 34 constituents that you could see in these wisdom exemplars. Having seen those themes just on this slide, I have highlighted what I thought were the most important. And there was a strong sense of agency and autonomy in the wisdom exemplars. And actually, they were very comfortable in dealing with uncertainty. And that was in contrast to some of the lower scorers who felt quite anxious when it came to dealing with uncertainty, would often be in a comfort zone, and that's where they would stay because it helped them navigate the world. Another really important theme was the golden rule. The wisdom exemplars very much didn't matter what background they were from, tended to follow the golden rule: do unto others as you would want for, do unto yourself, do unto others as you would want for yourself. And what's interesting about that is it's the sweet spot between altruism and looking after yourself. So the wisdom exemplars were growth orientated and very open-minded. And these, one really important thing I needed to mention is I came up with a really eccentric theory called the fish school theory. And I'll explain that in the next slide. So I will indulge in that eccentricity. And if it tells us anything, it tells us how nature can teach us about complex systems. And maybe, just maybe, it had a tiny glimpse into Aristotle's brilliant mind. Because when you constantly think about something, it can influence your worldview. Another huge thing that I thought was important was the wiser doctors, as empirically found, were happier doctors, because I added a question about how fulfilled they felt. So I think this fortifies the need to learn about practical wisdom. So here are the 34 constituents that I was talking about. And I wanted to, when I was doing my PhD, illustrate it. So I have these post-it notes that were exactly that shape, and I had a piece of A4 paper. And I thought I need to group these, categorize them into some kind of way. And that is literally what the post-it notes look like on the paper, and categorize them into qualities, context, mental habits, knowledge of self, relational and practical action. And the post-it notes would not fit on the piece of paper in a sort of straight line. So there's a bend in it. But that's interesting because that led to something quite creative, really. And I looked at this and I thought, well, that's really interesting. These themes. And some of them, I mean, I can't talk about them all, but I have begun to embed some of these in the medical education at the med school, start having sessions on healthy boundaries, talking about healthy boundaries. And that's really important when we're thinking about not burning out and potentially flourishing, talking about empathy and the golden rule, talking about failure is falling forward. So a lot of our medical students have never failed anything in their life. And it's having conversations about this, the intellectual humility, the openness, the ability to reframe and broad life experiences. So each one of these has a lot of history and evidence behind them. But what was really interesting about the arrow on these post-it notes is it kind of reinforces that wisdom is a process. Phronesis is a process. All previous models have just shown these certain characteristics as stationary. And so I began to think, well, that's really interesting. It does fit in with Aristotelian notions of Phronesis being a process, and it's moving towards action. It's moving towards activism. So again, I thought, oh, quite like this actually. There's something in it. And it crossed my mind. It was a very random thought. Oh, it looks like fish. So I'll come back to that. So I'll not talk too much about the various characteristics, and maybe that's something you want to explore in some of your groups. But what did the interviews reveal? The biggest difference between the highest scorer and the lowest scorers was dealing with uncertainty and locus of control. And another thing that came out is it's not just your academic ability, it's the metacognitive stuff that's really important. And you will see that most of these are psychological in background. I don't know if it's because I was GP myself, that the people I were interviewing were not actually that kind of knowledge required to be a GP. So then maybe that's an area of blindness. But what was interesting was these doctors stated that they were average at medical school, and maybe we're measuring the wrong thing at medical school. All interviewees expressed frustration with the system. They were working and learnt ways to navigate difficult organisational cultures. And the cultures were clearly obstacles. So that's getting a bit weird and abstract. There's a few slides like that, but let me explain. So if we can imagine each of these fish is an individual constituent of practical wisdom. There's 34, sorry, not 33 as the slide says. What's really important is the sum of the constituents are greater than the parts when they work synergistically. And obviously some of you will know that this is a concept of Gestalt. Aristotle described it as merology, or some people even describe it as emergence. And basically the whole is greater than the parts. Together as a school, the fish have a purposeful direction. And if we compare this to Phronesis, that is towards good. And so they move from telos, from purpose, to practice. And in this community, they are protected and nourished, and they are flourishing. And this is comparable with eudaimonia. This process is the intellectual virtue known as practical wisdom, Phronesis. And achieving Phronesis through this way is actualizing personal potential. And the reason why there's the Fibonacci spiral is because that is repeated on micro and macro levels in nature, and nature can teach us so much, especially about complex systems. So going back to this abstract slide, not only was I interested in the wisdom exemplars' lives, during the conclusion of my PhD, I started to read about Aristotle's life. He was born in Macedonia, ethnically different from the Athenian Greeks, and sometimes there was animosity. And after a period of teaching in the Lyceum in Athens, he left the Lyceum for a few years and he went to Lesbos. He got married and he had a daughter. Whilst he was there, he studied fish. He wrote a series of books called Parts of Animals, and he did this before his metaphysical, political, and ethical work. And then, when I started looking it up, there is literature to show that Aristotle's wider scientific work, that basically his concepts of telos and purpose and eudaimonia and flourishing were inspired by studying animals. And Aristotle wrote that an animal's telos is identified by observing its function within the wider ecosystem. So this whole fish school thing became really fascinating to me. And actually, because Aristotle himself doesn't attempt to distinguish biological from the philosophical, it makes sense to read all Aristotelian texts as potentially representative of the same philosophical outlook. So I've already mentioned something about emergence, and I'd love to spend more time immersing myself in learning more about that. But here's the important thing, and this is possibly the reason for the title of today's conference. Fish schools do not thrive in artificial environments. I compare this to our organizations. If the social grouping of the fish is disrupted, it can lead to stress. It's been observed that priorities change from the focus on swimming stamina to a focus on risk perception, which is fear behavior. The school needs the right environment to work effectively. Phronesis needs a suitable environment to develop, and this will be both on a personal and an organizational level. So this abstraction came to me while I was listening to a talk at a hay festival. So stay with me, I hope I can articulate it. So let's go back to the statement that an animal's telos is identified by observing its function within the wider ecosystem. So here is a quick abstraction where I go from holy via holism. The black hole represents stress and fear. We're kind of in times where I feel mindlessness prevails, emptiness, nothingness. Time is a monster, it's a vacuum, and we're not leaning into the mysteries of life. And in fact, I have many situations, and it also includes students, where everything seems to have a trigger warning, where it seems to be an excuse for avoiding catharsis and healing. And maybe the timing is inconvenient because life is so busy. There's no time for you to stop and think and work through this. And then if we move to the middle slide, I went to a talk that was actually about circular economies in relation to the environment. And in nature, there is no such thing as waste, but our economic models prioritize profit over ethics. And some of the examples we were given when we were talking about waste is some of our companies that are supposed to get rid of waste will not do it in the most ethical way because it is not the most profitable way. And this resonates with so many of our organizations that our economy almost acts against behaving ethically. So the arrows coming off are wasted energy. And actually economies are where stakeholder profits drive the agenda and little consideration is made for holistic approaches to ethics, and morality. And you can see how that is not whole, there is energy being wasted. So finally, we have the planet and people. And native and indigenous people inherently know that this is sacred. They prioritize flourishing ecosystems, rewilding, adopting permaculture principles widely, appreciating the sacredness of life, love, hope, and connectedness for each other and for the planet. So this is an Asklepion, an ancient Asklepion. This is one at Kos, and Hippocrates studied at this one. And some of you will know Galen studied at the Asklepion in Pergamon. So my thinking thus far got me into searching for an organizational heuristic that would embrace wisdom, healing and flourishing on both a personal and an organizational level. In fact, I felt the organizational promotion of wisdom and flourishing was even more important because we've all felt thwarted when our values don't align with organizational behaviors, and we all know that level of erosion. And guess what? The aha moment was when I realized the ancient Greeks already had established healing institutions, and it encompassed some of these things, and they called them Asklepions, Asklepiae in plural. They're named after Asclepius, the god of healing, son of the god Apollo, and the mortal Phronesis. There were over 320 Asklepions in the Mediterranean and Near Asia. They existed for over 1,000 years. I've heard that Asklepions inspired the modern hospice movement. So let me read you something from Edward Tick's book, The Practice of Dream Healing, Bringing Ancient Greek Mysteries into Modern Medicine. And you'll hear from him later today, which I'm absolutely thrilled about. So this is 1987. Epidaurus is on the eastern Peloponnesian coast of the near Saronic Gulf. Immediately upon my first arrival there, I quickly sensed why the Asklepian Centre of Healing had been placed on this site. Epidaurus snuggles on the wide, lush green plain encircled by the highest mountains on the Argoloid Peninsula. I wandered among the long, low ruins, passing in and out of the old bath and massage rooms, temples and dormitories and fountains. I examined archaic psychotherapy rooms where seekers had reported their symptoms and dreams to priests of Asklepios, attendants of the soul in sworn service to God, listened in absolute confidentiality and responded soothingly. The air was thick, warm and sweet, as though my lungs could gulp it and be restored. It was replete with birdsong, as if young flutists wandered the ruins to give ease to weary hearts. And everywhere there was a rustling. The shades of the ancient unseen seemed to throng the ruins. In the healing of God's sanctuary between the green mountains, I felt I was as low as I could be on the earth. There was no falling lower. I felt cupped in the palm of some giant hidden hand. Sorry. So finally, visits to Asklepions were called pilgrimages. Some people cringe when they hear that word, or others relish the opportunity. I've often thought pilgrimage is about a visit to a place, be it Lourdes, the Vatican, Mecca, Sedona, the Ganges, or more recently, football stadiums. Good old Wikipedia says, a pilgrimage is a journey, often into an unknown or foreign place, where a person goes in search of new or expanded meaning about their life, self, others, nature, or higher good through experience. It can lead to personal transformation, after which the pilgrims return to their daily lives. I've concluded that pilgrimage is personal intention. It is dedicated time in an era where we have no time, and it gives permission to heal, to forgive yourself in a way that consumes mind, body, heart, and spirit, and to seek and find some meaning. Think of a pilgrimage in relation to healing, health, and flourishing. I also looked at some etymologies at 11:30 last night, and I think they relate to role, goal, and soul. So to heal, the etymology is to cure, to save, to make whole, sound, and well. That would be the role, our role as healthcare professionals and the patient. Health, the definition of health, the etymology is wholeness, being whole, sound, or well, uninjured or repaired, a good omen. That's the goal. And let's go back to the Greek concept of eudaimonia, literally translating to good omen, good spirit. And this is widely interpreted as flourishing. Here we attend to the soul. If we contemplate words like this, we can see the path to healing the whole, aspiring to soul medicine. Do you think the role of healthcare professionals is to facilitate this in order to truly heal people? Hopefully, conversations today will explore that. More importantly, I think we should use the opportunity to be pilots in healthcare environments and organisations in which we want to deliver care and training. The NHS will be a mere kite mark in 20 years' time, according to Bob Gill. Whatever replaces it, let us be the shapers through medical education and our leadership. Let's use today to be intellectually creative and imagine a better way.